briefly, I'll start off talking about the Official Secrets Act in the UK. And it was established formally in 1911 and went through various reforms over the years until it eventually is in the final format so far is the 1989 Official Secrets Act. And as we obviously know in this day and age, a state, any state needs a certain degree of secrecy in order to function. But in a democratic state, where do you draw that line? Where is the line that you draw between holding back too much information and preventing the public from knowing enough to make informed decisions, and holding back perhaps less information so that you can have a proper view of what's going on in the public sphere. I've recently finished reading a book by Anne Rogers. The title is Secrecy and Power in the British State, A History of the Official Secrets Act. It was published in 1997. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a copy of it on any of the Amazon or whatever online browsers, so I went to Open Library and borrowed it on the web. And she writes that the problem with Britain's, well, she explains how, for instance, countries like Sweden have a slightly different approach to the sharing of information. They believe that all information should be public unless it can be, if they can prove for particularly persuasive reasons for keeping it secret. In the United States, they developed a system whereby freedom of information was spread across all institutions, and it was a deliberate policy designed as a corrective to what was considered the excessive secrecy of the British state. In the UK, she goes on to say, information policy starts from the position that all official information should be kept under the control of the state and only released according to the needs and desires of policymakers. This has earned Britain the dubious accolade of being the most secret of all contemporary Western democracies. She goes on to say that the liberal view is that secrecy and democracy are two sides of the same coin. That governments, as I said, require secrecy to function, but that it's open to reform and open to scrutiny so that the general public are informed of what's going on and can make democratic decisions appropriately. However, in practice, she argues that genuine democratic reform has not happened in this country. She goes on to say that changes to the secret state, usually defined as the organizations and legislations that are concerned with British national security policy, have singularly failed to alter the relationship between secrecy and democracy in Britain. The reason is simple. Reform has been carried out by policy-making elites who continue to make policy in support of their own interests and reflect their own biases. So, the Official Secrets Act has been used against a number of individuals over the years, starting from I'm only going so far back as to 1983, the case of Sarah Tisdall. She revealed that US nuclear missiles and the date of their arrival into the UK. She blew the whistle on that to The Guardian, and she was charged with breaking the Official Secrets Act, and she served time. following Sarah Tisdall, there was the case of Clive Ponting, who was a senior diplomat, a senior a government official, minister, I believe, and he revealed the lies that the government had told previously about the sinking of the Belgrano and the fact that it had actually been in retreat. Now, interestingly enough, in the Belgrano case, or Clive Ponting's case, the judge at the time directed the jury that regardless of the rights and wrongs of the case, he should not have made any disclosure whatsoever because it was not his job to do so. And he, I believe it was a male judge, said, the public interest is what the government of the day decides it is. And despite the judge stating that, the jury decided to acquit. They felt that Clive Ponting had done the right thing, that it was in the public interest to know that the Belgrano was not in fact posing a threat to British forces. And so they refused to convict. Following that, the government decided that this tiny loophole, which in actual fact wasn't a public interest defense at all, but it was nevertheless a tiny loophole, should be shut down. And so since 1989, the Official Secrets Act is basically, there's no defense, and it is, the public interest is what the government of the day says it is. In a so-called modern liberal democracy, such as the UK, I think that's an appalling position for us to be in. In my own particular case, I was working, as you know, at GCHQ at the time. I wasn't particularly politicized. However, as soon as the issue of Iraq became a focus of national attention, I became much more aware, and I decided I needed to become better informed about Iraq because it seemed to me that it was unjustified, that there was no reasonable reason for invading Iraq. And so I went in search of information, and I did this by reading various different articles across the spectrum and buying books, and I bought a couple of books from the local bookshop in Cheltenham, and was convinced, basically, from listening to people like Scott Ritter and Hans Blix and various other people who were in the know, who were saying as much as they could at the time, although they were being shut out by the mainstream media. There was no real reason for invading Iraq. And so when I saw this email that was from the National Security Agency in the US, from a chief of regional targets, Frank Koza, directed to GCHQ, specifying basically, it wasn't even really a request, a demand that GCHQ assist in the effort to bug and target the 6 UN Security Council delegations sitting on the council at the time, the 6 swing nations. And the actual content of the email, the specific wording of it was to gather, quote, the whole gamut of information that would give US policymakers an edge in obtaining results favorable to US goals. And as soon as I read that, it became clear to me that the motivation was to blackmail or bribe or do whatever was necessary to get these diplomats on the 6 swing nations to vote for authorizing an invasion of Iraq through the UN. And that was shocking to me. First of all, that the operation was deliberately political, and the means was to achieve war. Not only was it, that's 2 strikes, and then the 3rd strike was that it was a perverse corruption of the diplomatic processes within the UN. And so it was an enormous red flag to me, and the war was so imminent. It was clearly, we didn't actually realize quite how imminent. I felt it had to get out straight away to the public, and going through internal means, through GCHQ's own complicated processes, which clearly would not have worked because I, in fact, would have been shut down and presumably sacked as well. That is what would have happened, I believe. So that was just obviously not a viable option. I didn't have any direct contact with journalists because at GCHQ it's, drilled into us that the journalist is our foe. We must never speak or make friends with journalists. They are not trustworthy, and so all I knew was I had a contact who had contact with Yvonne Ridley, so I gave it to this contact. Yvonne Ridley, via a diversionary route, took it to Martin Bright, who's here in the room, at the Observer, and eventually after several weeks or 10 days or so of trying to authenticate the legitimacy of this email, they published it. The results of the publication are worth studying on their own, because it was front page news in the Observer, and it caused absolute shock and horror in certain quarters, principally in Chile, one of the countries which was being targeted. The Chilean ambassador had an interview with Martin, and apparently was close to tears. He was so distraught at the fact that they were once again being targeted in dirty tricks. Those stories didn't get covered in the media. The reaction, the global reaction. What happened was that the US, whether deliberately or not, we don't know, shut the story down. It didn't get covered in US networks at all. And the story pretty much got buried by the bigger story, which was we were going to war. Now, my own personal feelings on this issue have strengthened over the years, in the fact that I believe I did what I had to do, which was reveal to the public the duplicitous, illegal, immoral, underhand methods that were going on with the intelligence services, collaborating. The journalists did their job. They authenticated the email, they published it at some risk to their own credibility and even security. And yet, nothing was done politically. No MP, no politician who presumably read that front page newspaper on the Sunday, 2nd of March 2003, presumably thought, oh my God. In fact, my father, who was living in Taiwan at the time, had been for many years, he read that article online because he was an avid reader of The Guardian and The Observer online from Taiwan. It was his only real source of news in that country. And without knowing it had come from me, he said to my mother, who was somewhere else, oh my God, Jan, come and look at this. This is appalling. He had been following the story of Iraq. He felt that email spelt the end of the invasion of Iraq. No MP then or since has come to me and said, or come to Martin and said, you did the right thing. We should have supported you. We were against the war. I don't know why we didn't act on this. And this leaves me in a state of perplexity. I don't know why this is. You know, I know there are MPs with strong convictions. I know there were 100 or so MPs who didn't vote for the Iraq, the approval to go to war. But where were they? Some people, would say, well, you failed, Katharine. What you did had no effect. And I do, to some extent, feel like I failed because, Iraq happened. It's devastating. It's continuing to be devastating. I mean, it's going to have intergenerational effects for generations to come. It's a catastrophe, not just for Iraq, but on a global scale. The only small, tiny, minuscule comfort I can take from doing this is that there was no UN authorization for the invasion of Iraq. And, despite the fact that we have continued, we have gone in and disrupted countries, toppled leaders like Gaddafi, whether rightly or wrongly, we've done it in abhorrent manner. It is illegal, abhorrent to just depose people's leadership, their governments, with no national security threat to ourselves. Nevertheless, the Iraq war stands historically now on record as, I think we can all safely say, an illegal invasion. And, whether it ever will happen or not, it will be on the historical record, I hope now, that those leaders and the people who aided and abetted them in achieving this war are guilty of war crimes. So that ends my talk. If there are any questions.